So, good evening. And good morning. So we're roughly midway through the 14th chapter, the Supermind as Creator and the Life Divine. Though rare to experience, the supramental consciousness is something that we can approach through the mind and gain some understanding about, because they are not absolutely divergent realities. The mind is a delimited construct, a sort of limitation of what the supramental vast awareness is. So we can use our language to approximate what that might be, what that supreme awareness which creates the cosmos really could be. He uses terms which are symbolic and philosophic at once, drawing much of his vision in this regard from the Vedic seers, the rishis. So, when we last paused, he had described that above there is the formula of the One, the Satchit Ananda, eternally stable, immutable. Below, we have this formula of the Many, the manifest world that we know and move through with our mind, life, and body. And what is between, mediating, but this creative consciousness, which he has called supramental, that which is beyond the mind. And so we'll continue from this point, starting with the paragraph that begins, "But these terms are large and difficult to grasp. Let us come to precisions." Interesting term, precisions. Olive Berkeley in Modern Philosophy. Precisions are definitions which get rid of the dross and focus in on what is fundamentally true. So, precise definitions, we can say. We speak, he says, of the One as Satchit Ananda. But in the very description, we posit three entities and unite them to arrive at a trinity. Indicative of the mind, the three in one is a mental idea, which is constructive. It takes these three things and poses them as one being. So in a sense goes through a process by which they're combined. But to the mind, they're separate. So it's struggling to arrive at an idea of what is unity. But Satchit Ananda, as we have seen, is a conscious existence whose nature is delight, unwalled, infinite. And the mind knows no infinite. The mind grasps at real being, has a flickering consciousness and an unsteady experience of the world. So what is Ananda, what is true consciousness, and what is real being are all elusive concepts to the mind. So Sri Aurobindo says, we say existence, consciousness, bliss, and then we say they are one. It is a process of the mind. But for the Unitarian consciousness, such a process is inadmissible. Existence is consciousness, and there can be no distinction between them. Consciousness is bliss, and there can be no distinction between them. And since there is not even this differentiation, there can be no world. Let's back up. The term Unitarian has gained a kind of precise definition, refers to a person who belongs to a certain kind of Christian-oriented church. a Unitarian can mean or refer to a philosopher who is attempting to understand what the nature of unity is. And that's the term that Sri Aurobindo is using here. It doesn't refer to a Christian religion or to the idea that Jesus was a human and not God on earth. We can leave that aside. That's not part of our argument. What he's putting forward here is the idea that to this Unitarian philosophy, there can't be any bordering among these realities, existence, consciousness, and bliss. And if there is no bordering, if there is no differentiation permitted, then you can't arrive at a universe. The universe is impossible. If that Satchidananda exists, it's got to remain unmanifest. Perfectly unmanifest. Absorbed in eternity, if you can even use a word like eternity, before there is any temporal or spatial experimentation of being. So, to continue, if that is the sole reality, then world is not, and never existed, can never have been conceived, for indivisible consciousness is undividing consciousness, and cannot originate division and differentiation. But this is a reductio ad absurdum. We cannot admit it unless we are content to base everything upon an impossible paradox and an unreconciled antithesis. Okay, reductio ad absurdum means, refers to a proof of a proposition by proving the falsity of its contradictory. So you prove the other guy's wrong, and therefore you're right. So this is the first argument, that of the Unitarian, of an absolutist kind of view. There can be no manifestation because these three things cannot correlate in a way that would permit manifestation. Here's the next argument. On the other hand, mind can conceive with precision divisions as real. It can conceive a synthetic totality, or the finite extending itself indefinitely. It can grasp aggregates of divided things and the samenesses underlying them, but the ultimate unity and absolute infinity are to its conscience of things abstract notions and unseizable quantities, not something that is real to its grasp, much less something that is alone real. Here is therefore the very opposite term to the Unitarian consciousness. We have, confronting the essential and indivisible unity, an essential multiplicity which cannot arrive at unity without abolishing itself, and in the very act confessing that it could never really have existed. Yet it was. For it is this that has found unity and abolished itself. And again, we have a reductio ad absurdum, repeating the violent paradox which seeks to convince thought by stunning it, and the irreconciled and irreconcilable antithesis. So both absolutisms are characteristic of the mental perspective. You can lean towards an absolute, you arrive at no manifestation. You lean completely towards the multiplicity, you can't arrive back at unity. And yet, we see that from absolute Satchitananda, a universe has manifested itself, and from the other side, we can see that even though we're multiplied endlessly to the view, we can nevertheless arrive at unity with that origin and our deepest psychological experience. Logic be damned. These things are possible. The difficulty, he writes, in its lower term disappears if we realize that mind is only a preparatory form of our consciousness. So here he's going to answer these two arguments in reverse order. So let's deal with division first. Mind is only a preparatory form of our consciousness. Mind is an instrument of analysis and synthesis, but not of essential knowledge. Analysis, from that which loosens things, separates them in their component parts. Synthesis, which pulls things which are disparate together into a functioning unity. So this is mind. It's either dividing or trying to take what is divided and pulling it back together. But essential knowledge means the knowledge of what is in essence true and real. That means going behind the form, behind the formal division. Mind does not possess that capacity. Sri Aurobindo writes, its function is to cut out something vaguely from the unknown thing in itself and call this measurement or delimitation of it the whole, and again to analyze the whole into its parts, which it regards as separate mental objects. Echoes of Kant. So we've touched upon Berkeley earlier, and now we're into Kant. Ding an sich, the reality of the thing behind, ungraspable to our senses, ungraspable to the mind, because beyond its dimension of attainability. So we try to break things down into their components and reassemble them into something that we can understand. And he says, it is only the parts and accidents that the mind can see definitely and after its own fashion know. Of the whole, its only definite idea is an assemblage of parts or a totality of properties and accidents. So, part is partially known, and the whole is ever only an ensemble, which we have ordered into being. And we hold up and say, this is the world. This is the context in which all occurs. The whole, not seen as a part of something else or in its own parts, properties and accidents, is to the mind no more than a vague perception. Only when it is analyzed and put by itself as a separate constituted object, a totality and a larger totality, can mind say to itself, this now I know. And really, it does not know. It knows only its own analysis of the object and the idea it has formed of it by a synthesis of the separate parts and properties that it has seen. The whole, again, then, is reduced to a part which is knowable to the mind. If you reduce the universe to a small enough compass, you can begin to understand it. You try to grasp at a few of its properties. The accidents that it refers to are the collisions, the circumstances that occur within the context given. And this is our picture of the world. This is what we think we know. And it may resemble something that is real, but does it capture it? That's the question. Is that an essential knowledge? So, frankly, it knows only the model it has created. We develop a theory that tries to address all the facts that we can ascertain, and if all the facts are incorporated within that theory, we think, fine, we've had a good day. Let's go home. This is what the world looks like. Ever is it overpassed with the next wave of facts, with the next theory that encompasses a larger reality. So the mental understanding continues to shift. If that understanding is always developing, is it essential? Does it get to the essence, in other words? Does it have the entirety? Back to the mind, though. There, its characteristic power, the mind's power, its sure function ceases. And if we would have a greater, a profounder, and a real knowledge, a knowledge and not an intense but formless sentiment such as comes sometimes to certain deep but inarticulate parts of our mentality, mind has to make room for another consciousness, which will fulfill mind by transcending it, or reverse and so rectify its operations after leaping beyond it. The summit of mental knowledge is only a vaulting board from which that leap can be taken. The utmost mission of mind is to train our obscure consciousness, which has emerged out of the dark prison of matter, to enlighten its blind instincts, random intuitions, vague perceptions, till it shall become capable of this greater light and this higher ascension. Mind is a passage, not a culmination. So the purpose of mind is limited necessarily. Its function fulfilled, it has to be overpassed. It gives us a tentative picture of the world, and then when we have climbed to its topmost plank, we're ready to leave it, we're ready to transcend it, to go into the beyond. And maybe we come back and recast in mental terms what a greater picture of that reality is. But we must rest more certainly in that higher consciousness. We must be willing to leave behind the mind as leader of the life. So that's the lower argument dealt with, the argument from division. Now to the larger. On the other hand, the Unitarian consciousness, or indivisible unity, cannot be that impossible entity, a thing without contents, out of which all contents have issued, and into which they disappear and become annihilated. Right? Reductio ad absurdum. It must be an original self-concentration in which all is contained, but in another manner than in this temporal and spatial manifestation. So all analogical reasoning must be set aside. We can't really grasp what is that infinite by casting it into ideas of spatial extension. It's an analogy which is useful to convey to us what vastitude is. But what it really is beyond even that. It is not geometric. It exists before the world of mathematics comes into being, no? So this being has self-concentrated. Hold on to that. That which has thus concentrated itself is the utterly ineffable and inconceivable existence which the nihilist images to his mind as the negative void of all that we know and are. But the transcendentalist, with equal reason, may image to his mind as the positive but indistinguishable reality of all that we know and are. You remember the argument long back, many chapters ago now. Do we call it non-being or do we call it being? And the Upanishads lined up on either side of that. But to Sri Aurobindo, the non-being is that transcendence which is free even of its determination as positive being. And yet that non-being arrives at the formulation of positive being by which this universe is extended and held. So ultimately, his view combines both. There is justice to be found in both perspectives. And in Sri Aurobindo's spiritual life, he realized both. Not through thinking, not through philosophic disquisition, but through deep pondering, through self-identity. So ever, the real answer to these largest questions is yogic, interior, not philosophic. And yet, in the Life Divine, he's presenting in philosophic terms, as best as language can capture it, what is reality, essentially, universally, and individually. So, he quotes the Chandogya Upanishad again. We're well familiar with it now. In the beginning, says the Vedanta, was the one existence without a second. But before and after the beginning, now, forever, and beyond time, is that which we cannot describe even as the one, even when we say that nothing but that is, because it exceeds and escapes even its own self-formulation as Satchit Ananda, existence, consciousness, bliss. That cannot be contained in Satchit Ananda. Secondly, I think I've missed my place, just a moment. What we can be aware of is first, its original self-concentration, which we endeavor to realize as the indivisible one. Secondly, the diffusion and apparent disintegration of all that was concentrated in its unity, which is the mind's conception of the universe. And thirdly, its firm self-extension in the truth consciousness, which contains and upholds the diffusion and prevents it from being a real disintegration, maintains unity and utmost diversity and stability and utmost mutability, insists on harmony in the appearance of an all-pervading strife and collision, keeps eternal cosmos where mind would arrive only at a chaos, eternally attempting to form itself. This is the supermind, the truth consciousness, the real idea which knows itself and all that it becomes. So first there is that self-concentration into the one. And then there's a universe which exists as a maximum diffusion and apparent disintegration apprehendable to the mind. And then third is this self-extension in a truth consciousness which maintains the values of both unity and diversity, arriving at an all-encompassing harmony. And that is the supermind, bridging the two. So there's the one, there's the many, there's the supramental consciousness in between, which mediates between the one, rendering the one into manyness without forfeiting the unity. There is no disintegration. There is no real division. The division is an index to the limitation of the mind to penetrate with its vision what is really there. So we think there is division when there is only differentiation. That is the nature of our limited experience. But we do have the capacity to evolve and grow and get to that topmost plank of the mind, whereby we can leap upwards into a greater experience and meet this supramental consciousness, and thus arrive at the resolution of all these contraries. Being, non-being, the one, the many, consciousness, insentience, suffering, bliss. So, you could say, if you wanted to play with words, that supermind really knows itself because it has the real idea. The real idea is the way Satchit Ananda thinks, and the agency of the supermind and what it conceives of is necessarily real because all that is in it is reality. It exists, Sat. So what is conceived in that as an expression of that real existence is necessarily real and necessarily conscious. So the real idea knows its placement in the largest truth, even as it issues itself into minute definition. But, back to the larger context, Sri Aurobindo continues, supermind is the vast self-extension of the Brahman that contains and develops. An important concept here. So, this supramental consciousness takes the vastitude of Satchit Ananda and establishes itself as an all-containing reality. It becomes broad. By the idea, it develops the triune principle of existence, consciousness, and bliss out of their indivisible unity. It differentiates them, but it does not divide. It establishes a trinity, not arriving like the mind from the three to the one, but manifesting the three out of the one, for it manifests and develops, and yet maintaining them in the unity, for it knows and contains. So the supramental is the Brahmic source of emarginate self-extension. There are no borders. This is the ground of being from which the universe arises. It is true consciousness. It is real being. It explores itself for one purpose, as we shall see again and again, for delight. By the differentiation, it is able to bring forward one or other of them as the effective deity which contains the others involved, or explicit in itself. And this process, it makes the foundation of all other differentiations. In other words, it can use being as base, it can use consciousness as base, it can use the experience of Ananda as the base, the aspect of will, the aspect of knowledge. However it wishes to play, it always does it within the largest possible harmony and coherent context. There is no division. There's no outside. Everything is inside, even when it is made manifest and formal. It hasn't left the essence behind. And it acts by the same operation on all the principles and possibilities which it evolves out of this all-constituent trinity. It possesses the power of development, of evolution, of making explicit. And that power carries with it the other power of involution, of envelopment, of making implicit. In a sense, the whole of creation may be said to be a movement between two involutions, spirit, in which all is involved, and out of which all evolves downward to the other pole of matter, matter, in which also all is involved, and out of which all evolves upward to the other pole of spirit. So the one involution, the one becomes the many. The other involution, the many return to the one. Thus, the whole process of differentiation by the real idea, creative of the universe, is a putting forward of principles, forces, forms, which contain for the comprehending consciousness all the rest of existence within them, and front the apprehending consciousness with all the rest of existence implicit behind them. Therefore, all is in each, as well as each in all. So the basis is the comprehending conscious power of the supramental. And then the apprehending power of the supramental seizes upon all things and finds the oneness in the many. And all are in each is in all. This goes back to that wonderful idea of the peacock spreading its fan. You know, it's why so many of us feel so close to that idea, because when the peacock spreads its fan, all the eyes on all the feathers can see all the other eyes, and each can see the all, and all sees each, and all are one, and one are all. It's a picture of a spiritual victory in which the multiplicity is never lost in the unity, and the unity exults in the multiplicity. But there is only one. Therefore, again, all is in each, as well as each in all. Therefore, every seed of things implies in itself all the infinity of various possibilities, but is kept to one law of process and result by the will, that is to say, by the knowledge force of the conscious being who is manifesting himself, and who, sure of the idea in himself, predetermines by it his own forms and movements. So there's this comprehending, apprehending aspect of the supramental. There's the knowledge force. In Sanskrit, that would be jnana shakti, of the conscious being, the chit shakti. So knowledge force is an aspect of conscious being who, sure of the idea in himself, because it all arrives at the tip of manifestation from real, genuine, authentic being, and then goes out into manifestation, determined by the self. So in its vision it has already seen the beginning, the continuation, and the end. So you could say in the supramental there is perfect predetermination. If you're afraid of that term, I'm sorry. But this consciousness sees all at once. Remember, it has past, present, and future, all in its one view. There's one moment to it, and all is a unity. Eternity has not divided into the way the mind divides the experience of movement as past, present, and future. All exists at once. So its goal upon conception is already attained. And yet the movement occurs. The seed, he writes, is the truth of its own being, which this self-existence sees in itself. The resultant of that seed of self-vision is the truth of self-action, the natural law of development, formation, and functioning, which follows inevitably upon the self-vision and keeps to the processes involved in the original truth. So the real idea necessarily self-effectuates its vision in the whole and in the particular, in the sum as in the parts, because they are each in all and all in each. All nature is simply then the seer will, the knowledge force of the conscious being at work to evolve in force and form all the inevitable truth of the idea into which it has originally thrown itself. This goes back to the earlier section of the chapter where Sri Aurobindo used the term seer will as the English translation of kavi kratu, the one who sees as a poet sees and does, creates a perfect poem in the very visioning of it. Knowledge force, again, jnana shakti, and conscious being, again, chit shakti. All of this expressive of the rita chit, the real idea. So, this conception of the idea points us to the essential contrast between our mental consciousness and the truth consciousness. So now we're going to compare and contrast the two. We've seen in essence how Sri Aurobindo would describe the supramental using symbolic and philosophic language. An all-at-once consciousness, which is many-sided, yet never loses its unity. This is not inconceivable to us as an idea, but it's not part of our actual experience. This is the actual experience of the supramental, but to us, it sounds fantastic. So, let me start that paragraph again. This conception of the idea points us to the essential contrast between our mental consciousness and the truth consciousness. We regard thought as a thing separate from existence, abstract, unsubstantial, different from reality, something which appears one knows not whence and detaches itself from objective reality in order to observe, understand, and judge it. For so it seems, and therefore is to our all-dividing, all-analyzing mentality. The first business of mind is to render discrete, to make fissures much more than to discern. And so it has made this paralyzing fissure between thought and reality. But in supermind, all being is consciousness. All consciousness is of being, and the idea, a pregnant vibration of consciousness, is equally a vibration of being pregnant of itself. It is an initial coming out in creative self-knowledge of that which lay concentrated in uncreative self-awareness. It comes out as idea that is a reality, and it is that reality of the idea which evolves itself, always by its own power and consciousness of itself, always self-conscious, always self-developing by the will inherent in the idea, always self-realizing by the knowledge ingrained in its every impulsion. This is the truth of all creation, of all evolution. So, our mental view of the world is necessarily partial, fraught with error. The mind, dividing reality up, separates thought from reality, cannot conjoin the two. But in the supramental, conscious being gives birth to an idea that is true and self-expressive at once, and ever harmonizing. The idea, I think, which is really captured in the image of the Tantra, of the Divine Mother as Sri Lalita Tripurasundari. She is playing, sporting in the triple worlds, manifesting Satchit Ananda Rupini. she has the form of Satchit Ananda and gives birth to its multitudes through this consciousness. And so the idea of a divine mother giving birth is not made explicit here in this chapter. And yet we'll find how important it is to Sri Aurobindo's conception of the world in coming decades. So, in Supermind, being, consciousness of knowledge, and consciousness of will are not divided as they seem to be in our mental operations. They are a trinity, one movement with three effective aspects. Being, which has great and real knowledge, and being, which has all effective will. And knowledge and will are mutually enforcing and supportive. Both are aspects of real being. So the supramental being affects what it knows. It does not falter in the doing of things. Well, that's not our experience. We may have a grand idea, but it's awfully hard to make it come into form. We may have a lot of power, but might be dumb as a box of rocks and can't get anything effective done that way either. At least it's not creative. So here he's repeating an earlier observation, but what is true of Satchidananda in essence is true of it in deployment through the supramental consciousness as well, you see. So each has its own effect. Being gives the effect of substance. Consciousness, the effect of knowledge, of the self-guiding and shaping idea of comprehension and apprehension. Will gives the effect of self-fulfilling force. But the idea is only the light of the reality illumining itself. It is not mental thought nor imagination, but effective self-awareness. It is real idea. Rita Chit, he keeps coming back to this because it is urgent that we understand how different the supramental consciousness is from what we experience mentally. We must understand that it is unitive, that will and knowledge are part of the same being. Power and consciousness are not divided in a true all-encompassing awareness which defines the supramental expression of the Satchitananda above. It's a reassertion of unity. They cannot be really separated there, knowledge and will. In Supermind, knowledge in the idea is not divorced from will in the idea, but one with it, just as it is not different from being or substance, but is one with the being, luminous power of the substance. As the power of burning light is not different from the substance of the fire, so the power of the idea is not different from the substance of the being, which works itself out in the idea and its development. So there's a good analogy. If you need something to compare it to, the light and the power of the fire to burn are not distinguishable. They're part of a single reality. And just so, the idea is part of the substance of being. It's not something frothy that's thrown off by it. It is something substantive. In our mentality, all are different. We have an idea and a will according to the idea, or an impulsion of will and an idea detaching itself from it, but we differentiate effectually the idea from the will and both from ourselves. I am The idea is a mysterious abstraction that appears in me. The will is another mystery, a force nearer to concreteness, though not concrete, but always something that is not myself, something that I have or get or am seized with, but am not. So in our divided mental experience, we have a sense of what we are, we have a sense of what our self is, and will force comes and goes. Sometimes it's strong, we don't seem to have command of it. The idea may visit us, but depart. All of these three things are divisible to our experience. They are not an identity, which they would be in the supramental consciousness. I make a gulf, he writes, also between my will, its means, and the effect. For these I regard as concrete realities outside and other than myself. Therefore, neither myself, nor the idea, nor the will in me are self-effective. The idea may fall away from me, the will may fail, the means may be lacking, I myself, by any or all of these lacunae, may remain unfulfilled. So, to the mind, if an idea or will movement fail, the self experiences failure and thus experiences dissatisfaction. But to the supramental, the means are necessarily part of one being. Even if they are formally exterior, they're still part of one being. All is in each is in all. And so in the seeing of what it wishes to accomplish, the means and the will line up behind that power of knowledge and effectuate it. Why? Because it's all part of one being. There is no division. To us, all of these are fragments and aspects which are discontinuous to us. We can assemble them sometimes into a ready shape, but they fall out of our hands. We lose the instrument. I forgot to bring the hammer. I can't drive the nail, etc. But in the supermind, there is no such paralyzing division, because knowledge is not self-divided, force is not self-divided, being is not self-divided, as in the mind. They are neither broken in themselves nor divorced from each other. For the supermind is the vast. It starts from unity, not division. It is primarily comprehensive. Differentiation is only its secondary act. So let's recall the idea of the Brahmic ground, Brahman being broadly spread, the expression of real being as it grows and manifests. That is real nature, reality. Nature is ultimately Sat. And this is the comprehending aspect of the supramental as it brings Sat into manifestation, draws that existence out of the triune oneness of Satchit Ananda for manifestation. This is the creative consciousness, first laying the ground, yes, the ground upon which all will stand. This is the comprehending consciousness, the establishment of unity spread broadly. Therefore, whatever be the truth of being expressed, the idea corresponds to it exactly. The will force to the idea. Force being only power of the consciousness, and the result to the will. Nor does the idea clash with other ideas, the will or force with other will or force, as in man and his world, for there is one vast consciousness which contains and relates all ideas in itself as its own ideas. One vast will which contains and relates all energies in itself as its own energies. It holds back this, advances that other, but according to its own preconceiving idea will. So the creative universal consciousness of supermind clearly distinguishes its reality from the mind's view of the universal by dint of this identity of being. So you might say there are two universes, the one which is the manifestation of the supramental consciousness above, in which it experiences itself, and to our experience, a second universe here. How will we relate these two? How does one get derived from the other? And that's part of the cosmology that Sri Aurobindo will continue to unroll for us. But one more paragraph. This is the justification of the current religious notions of the omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence of the divine being. Far from being an irrational imagination, they are perfectly rational and in no way contradict either the logic of a comprehensive philosophy or the indications of observation and experience. The error is to make an unbridgeable gulf between God and man, Brahman and the world. That error elevates an actual and practical differentiation in being, consciousness, and force into an essential division. But this aspect of the question we shall touch upon afterwards. At present, we have arrived at an affirmation and some conception of the divine and creative supermind in which all is one in being, consciousness, will, and delight, yet with an infinite capacity of differentiation that deploys but does not destroy the unity, in which truth is the substance, and truth rises in the idea, and truth comes out in the form, and there is one truth of knowledge and will, one truth of self-fulfillment, and therefore of delight. For all self-fulfillment is satisfaction of being. Therefore, always, in all mutations and combinations, a self-existent and inalienable harmony. So this differentiation of self from larger self is practical, not essential, for us to conceive of an unbridgeable divide between what we are and what the divine is, God, if you like, is destructive and erroneous. The object of this true self's action in the universe is delight. This inalienable harmony is the goal of all of our efforts in the world, not simply to recapture it by recapturing the essence of our being, by finding the bliss at the center of our souls, but to make it manifest, to make that supramental reality, that all-comprehending harmony there, which apprehends the beauty, the mystery, the divinity, and all things that it meets, part of our experience here upon this earth, on this globe, self reaching out to self, finding all becomings in the ground of nature, in matter, in life, in mind, in thought, healing division, revealing the unity, springing that ananda into free expression as beauty, as love. This is our goal. This is what we signed up to do when we came here. So, whether there's a little left to do or a lot to do, it is our work. So, I think that's the nature of the 14th chapter. I've kept you a long time tonight, I think. We'll take up the 15th chapter, and by now you've had the chance to go back and look at the table of contents and find everything that is coming up in the cosmology. So, thank you for being with us again. I'm going to take just a moment to mention that a friend of mine who has been with me from the beginning of this center in Pensacola, P.K. Ramchandra, is in a difficult situation in a hospital in Pondicherry. Ram is one of the purest and most noble beings I ever met, and is the soul of integrity. I don't know that Ram could intentionally do a wrong act. In 1979, when M.P. Pandit and Vasanti Rao were here in Pensacola, Ram drove all the way from Columbia, Missouri, with a group of friends. They arrived here and stayed for some days, and our family accommodated everybody that was present. And they all got up and drove back. Right after our midnight meditation, January 1, 1980, they all piled back in their car and drove back. Ram would drive all night. Ram was a PhD candidate at the time in chemical engineering at the University of Missouri. And I well remember how his friends, Vinod and Jatinder, told me that they were in different programs, one in nuclear physics, the other in medical physics. And when they got difficulties, insoluble problems, and they had banged their head against them, they would come to Ram, who would be busy laboring at his own doctoral dissertation, and say, "We can't figure this out." And he would listen to them complain for a while, and they would say, "Leave it with me, go." And Vinod said, we would go off and eat some nice Indian food, take a nap, and we'd come back, and invariably Ram would have solved the problem. It wasn't even his field, but he had such genius that he could penetrate anything and find the resolution for it. He got his PhD. He worked for a few years in America, and then he had the opportunity to go to the Sri Aurobindo ashram and lived there. Within a few years, he became a member of the ashram and worked at the dispensary. And there too, any problem that nobody else could address, they brought to Ram. Whether it was a technical engineering question or whether it was a social problem, all problems got presented to Ram. Samarasya Parayana, he was a source of universal harmony. Without describing the nature of the challenge that besets him in terms of his health just now, I would ask you to incline your good thoughts in the direction of our dear friend. Ram is more than a friend. Ram is a brother. And whether you've met him or not, You love him, you just don't know it yet. So please send him good energy. He is a great man and a great soul. Ramchandra, P.K. Ramchandra. Ram. Well, Jai Ma, Namaste.
Namaste.